Okay, so starting off today's show, I want to talk about the shocking announcement that came literally out of nowhere yesterday. And when I mean came out of nowhere, I mean literally came out of nowhere. And that is that the Brooklyn Nets, a team that we kind of knew was looking for a guy to be that next coach, they decided to hire Steve Nash, the former point guard of the Dallas Mavericks, and more important, more well known for his time winning two MVPs. As the point guard of the Phoenix Suns, was a Los Angeles Laker as well. So he was announced yesterday as the new head coach of the Brooklyn Nets. And announcements like this are very rare because they came out of nowhere. There was zero speculation. I had never even knew that Steve Nash was even considering being a head coach in the NBA. But the deeper you look into this, and the more and more you break it down, I actually think this is going to be a pretty solid hire for the Brooklyn Nets. And there are a couple things that come to mind here when breaking down the situation. Number one, Steve Nash, if you didn't know, actually worked with the Golden State Warriors in the past, over the last couple years when they won their two championships. And his exact position was player development coach, and he worked a lot with Kevin Durant during his time in Golden State. And the other thing that stood out to me here when reviewing the basic details of this was that Steve Nash signed a 4-year contract to coach with the Brooklyn Nets. So he's going to have a lot of security to start off right away. He's going to have 4 years under his belt to start. And I don't really have a problem with that because KD and Kyrie should be in Brooklyn for that time at least. And also the two comparable coaching hires made that you could compare Steve Nash with are Steve Kerr and Derek Fisher. Both of those guys were former NBA point guards who had no previous coaching experience. As a matter of fact, I guess you could say Steve Nash had a little more coaching experience because he had that experience winning a championship or two with Golden State. But both Kerr and Fisher, signed 4-year deals when they came to start off their head coaching career. And Kerr and Fisher are the two guys that I said you could really compare Steve Nash to. And I guess they really both show both sides of the cycle and what could possibly happen with a hire like this if it does work out. And then if it doesn't work out, I guess you could throw Jason Kidd into this equation as well. And I know any Brooklyn Net fan listening to this show is very familiar with the Jason Kidd hire because it's very similar. I understand that back in the day when the Brooklyn Nets had that core built around Darren Williams and Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett, that Brooklyn Net and Joe Johnson and Brook Lopez, that Brooklyn Net team didn't really have the same stars as the current Brooklyn Net team has with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. But we know Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett, their personalities and what they have accomplished throughout their basketball career, that was kind of similar. Like their personalities and their vibes are kind of similar to the KDs and the Kyries. But at the same time, we know that in terms of level and ability as basketball players, Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are two different animals. I still believe when he is healthy, Kevin Durant is one of the 2 or 3 best players in the NBA. And when you compare that with Steve Nash and everything that he accomplished as a player during his time, specifically as a Phoenix Sun, I think that this is going to be a hire that could really work out for the Brooklyn Nets. When they hired Jason Kidd, even though it was his first time coaching as well, you could kind of tell that early it wasn't really going to work out. You remember when he had one of his, I believe it was Joe Johnson, but he had one of his players knock into him, forcing him to spill his water, which forced the referee to clean the floor and call an extra timeout for the Brooklyn Nets. Ever since that happened, and that's going to be one of those NBA basketball moments where I never forget it, I kind of just knew Jason Kidd really wasn't the right guy for the job there. And then you could kind of tell a couple months later when he tried to force his way into an executive role and he tried to get the keys to the castle of the Brooklyn Net organization. Unfortunately for him, that didn't work out. He ended up becoming the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. That did not work out as well, and we know now that he is a head coach for Frank Vogel and the Los Angeles Lakers there. But anyway, going back to Steve Nash. So you could see that Jason Kidd and Derek Fisher, hires like that, are the kind of hires where you hire an all-time, I don't want to say an all-time great player, but a very good player, a guy that, a very successful NBA player, and more specifically, a very successful NBA point guard. It's kind of like baseball with the catcher position. More times than not, the managers in Major League Baseball that are getting hired are either a catcher or pitcher, just because that those are two of the smartest positions in the game. I think you could really say the same thing about point guard in basketball. And even though Derek Fisher and Jason Kidd didn't necessarily work out as head coaching hires, you could look at Steve Kerr as a guy that was hired for the Golden State Warriors. A guy that, when he was hired, had zero head coaching experience. And I'll admit it, this was one of the times where I was very wrong. I said, what are the Golden State Warriors doing when they decided to fire Mark Jackson? If you remember, they had a core of a young Steph Curry and a young Klay Thompson, and both of those guys led the Golden State Warriors to the playoffs for back-to-back years. Unfortunately, they couldn't get out of the first round, and after they lost those back-to-back, or actually they got out of the first round the first year they made the playoffs, but they couldn't get to a conference finals. So even more evidence that Mark Jackson should not have been fired. And they decided to let go of Mark Jackson. And I remember at the time saying to myself, what the hell are these guys doing? This is a decision that won't make any sense. This Warriors franchise hasn't been good in ages. And they decided to fire one of the better head coaches they had, and a guy that when no one expected them to make the playoffs, Mark Jackson led them to the playoffs. I was like, what the hell are these guys doing? And then ultimately, they decided to bring in Steve Kerr, and we know what has happened since. And from that perspective, I think when you look at the Brooklyn Nets here, the fact that they decided to hire Steve Nash, a guy that when you watch him on the floor, you could see he is one of the smartest basketball players you've ever seen. His basketball IQ is off the roof. The way he passes the ball, the way he found his teammates in open positions, his speed, his ability. He could shoot too. Like, he has a little bit of experience now with Golden State, and the fact that he's going to be leading a team filled with stars like Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, and some really good role players that I believe are ready to explode onto the scene, like Karis LeVert and Joe Harris, Spencer Dinwiddie, Jared Allen. I think next year, early, when you look at this Brooklyn Nets team and you look at the way the Eastern Conference is set up right now, I actually think Steve Nash could put the Nets as early as next year in a real position to succeed. And for the people that don't like the hire, I understand that you're going to say, how is it possible that a white coach that has had zero head coaching experience in his career, has had zero assistant coaching in his career, zero experience in any of those criterias, how is he all of a sudden going to become the new head coach of an NBA team when there are only 30 possible spots for that? And my counter to that would be, look, usually I totally understand the argument that a guy with zero experience, why should he get the job? Like, that doesn't make any sense. But at the same time, I think when you look closer and closer at this scenario, and when you look at the fact that Kevin Durant, a guy that, let's face it, the Brooklyn Nets decided to let go of Kenny Atkinson midway through last year. You guys remember what Kenny Atkinson was able to do with the Brooklyn Nets 2 years ago when D'Angelo Russell was there, right? That Brooklyn Net team hadn't been a playoff team in ages. They had not a lot of optimism going into that 2018-2019 season. And D'Angelo Russell, after the season started off pretty tough, and Kenny Atkinson, they led that Brooklyn Net team all the way to the playoffs. And if you remember, that series in the first round with Philadelphia, even though they won the first game and lost the next four and the series was over, for the games in Brooklyn in that series, the Nets easily had a chance to win some of those games, and we could have had ourselves a legitimate series. And I think when you look at that, and you consider everything that went down, and then you fast forward to the fact that Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving last offseason saw all of the pieces that the Brooklyn Nets had and said, we want to join. We want to go to Brooklyn. And Kevin Durant still hasn't played 1 second of basketball for the Brooklyn Nets. We know what happened with Kyrie Irving this season. It really didn't start off too well. And before you know it, Kenny Atkinson was fired. And everyone realized when that announcement was made, like, guys, what are we doing here? I know Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are basically the two owners of the team. More specifically, Kevin Durant. I don't really know how much Kyrie Irving was behind it, but we knew that basically whatever Kevin Durant says goes. And that was going to be the case really wherever he went. You know, Kevin Durant is the kind of player where he's so good. If he wants to, you know, all of a sudden become the quote-unquote GM of the team or the quote-unquote owner of the team, he's so good that in order to have that guy play basketball for your squad, you're going to want to, you know, give him whatever he wants. And I guess he just didn't really click with Kenny Atkinson. Brooklyn decides to hire Jacques Vaughn as the interim head coach. Vaughn does an okay job, leads the Nets to the playoffs this year. He's actually going to remain on the staff of Steve Nash, and Steve Nash ends up getting the job. But anyways, Steve Nash is a guy that even though he has zero head coaching experience, when you ask, you know, NBA historians, people that have been watching the NBA since day one, who is the best pure passer they've ever seen? Who has the best court vision you've ever seen? A lot of them are going to say Steve Nash. And I understand Steve Nash was never able to win an NBA championship during his career, but his team with the Phoenix Suns, they were really good. Every year, they either got knocked out by Kobe Bryant or the Lakers on a crazy, you know, Ron Artest buzzer beater, or the other, you know, major Steve Nash team that he could never get by really was the San Antonio Spurs. The Suns had some epic series with the Spurs in the past. And when you know, if you would have asked any of Steve Nash's teammates when he was playing, after his playing career is over, do you think this guy could possibly be a head coach and a successful one? I guarantee you all of his teammates would say yes. I guarantee you if you ask Mike D'Antoni the same thing, he would say yes. And Steve Nash is going to get that chance to become the next head coach of the Brooklyn Nets, coaching two of the best players in the league in Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. And the other thing is this. I think if you were to ask me, Zach, in the end, after it's over, are the Brooklyn Nets going to look at the Steve Nash, Kyrie Irving, and Kevin Durant era as a success or a failure? I think they're going to look at it as a success because next year, when you look at the Eastern Conference, first of all, it's not like this summer is like last summer where you have a ton of free agents on the block. We know basically where all of the stars are going to be playing next year, the superstars. Unless there's, you know, a crazy trade, but we know that Kawhi is going to be a Clipper, LeBron and AD are going to be Lakers. Most likely James Harden is going to be a Rocket. I don't know if they trade him. I don't think they trade him, excuse me. You know, we know Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are going to be Brooklyn Nets. We know Jason Tatum is going to be a Boston Celtic. So we know basically where all the stars throughout the NBA are going to be next year. Giannis is the other one I forgot, obviously. Next year is going to be his last year under contract with the Milwaukee Bucks. So when we look at the way the Eastern Conference is set up, we see that the Milwaukee Bucks right now are struggling. They're down 2-0 with the Miami Heat. And if they get knocked out of the playoffs early this year in the second round by the Miami Heat, I'm going to have a hard time believing that next year they should go into the season as the favorite to come out of the Eastern Conference. You look at Toronto, as great of a regular season as they had, they should be down 3-0 in their series against the Boston Celtics right now if it wasn't for a crazy pass and a crazy shot. We're going to get to that game in a little bit, just how crazy that game 3 was last night between the Boston Celtics and the Toronto Raptors. But Toronto, I've said it since the beginning of the playoffs, they don't have a guy that could close out games for them, and I think that's going to bite them down the stretch. So going into next season, I'm going to have a hard time believing Toronto is going to be the team to beat in the East. Boston may be. I think they're one piece away. I think they need a center. If they come out of the Eastern Conference this year, which is very possible, I could possibly see them being the favorite. But could I pick a team led by Jason Tatum over Kevin Durant? As much as I love Jason Tatum, I'm not ready to do that yet. But if any team were to, challenge Brooklyn, it would probably be Boston. And then you have Miami, who's going to be in the mix as well. But, they were the number 5 seed in the East this year. As good as Jimmy Butler is, I don't know if I'm ready to pick his team over Kyrie and KD's Nets. So the point is, next year, Brooklyn should be one of the top favorites in the Eastern Conference. And what does that mean? Is the pressure going to be on Steve Nash? Absolutely. But I think the way the team is built and his pedigree, I think the ingredients are there for this Brooklyn Net team to really succeed. And I'm very curious to see how this hire ends up going down, because I'm a big fan of Steve Nash. I'm a big fan of how he played the game with his court vision. And even though there's going to be a lot of pressure on him, I'm looking forward to see if he's up to the challenge.